This is your PSA. If you haven't got shopping done, might want to get it done. I got most of mine done, not all of it, but the lady that works with Randy took her shopping the other day, and Randy made sure to get Chloe something. That's my dog, for those of you that don't know. She's the master of the house. Cecilia and I just live there. But you can be turning, if you have your Bibles, to the book of Acts this morning, Acts chapter 9. If you were male or female, he didn't discriminate about dragging you off to jail. It didn't matter if you were sitting down in your home eating dinner with your family. It didn't matter to him if you were a mother or father or a son or a daughter. All that mattered to him was that you were a threat to the religion that he grew up with. He had a resume about him. He received the best education in his day. He received education at one of the best Jewish teachers that there was. Not long ago, he saw a man being stoned to death for preaching Jesus. And this fellow that I'm describing to you, when he saw that happen, said, "I approve of that. I'm glad that occurred." He might have heard Jesus himself speak at one point in time. He probably stood in a crowd when Jesus was addressing Jews and heard Jesus say to Pharisees, "You bind heavy burdens on men that are hard to bear, but you yourselves are willing to move your finger." And if this young man heard that, that would have lit a fire in him. And this man was Saul of Tarsus. And we're going to be talking about him this morning, and specifically his road to Demascus. The road to Damascus is the title of our lesson this morning. Saul was on this road to Damascus, and we'll talk some about what that entailed in a moment, but he didn't have any idea about how drastically his life was about to change. What I want to do this morning with our text in Acts 9 is try to look at the mindset that Saul had when he was going on this trip, because he had a conviction about what he ought to do and what he strove to do. He had a confrontation that was going to occur on this trip, and he had a challenge he was given as a result of this trip, and we're going to notice all three of those this morning. But let's talk about Saul's conviction. He had an unshakable conviction that Christianity must be destroyed. The passage that we looked at last week was Acts chapter 9, verses 1 through 2. That passage says that Saul was still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord. He went to the high priest and asked for letters to the synagogue at Demascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to prison. Luke said that, you notice he said Saul was still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord. Remember, Stephen has already been stoned at this point. He saw that happen. He saw that man die. And that didn't extinguish Saul's enthusiasm at all to put an end to Christianity. It fanned the flames of it even more. When we talk about convictions, you probably have convictions of your own that are unshakable. Some of them might be more trivial matters, but when it comes to concerts and paying tickets for them and things like that, I have convictions about, well, this artist is worth going to see money for and traveling the distance, and this one not so much so. When Cecilia and I went to a concert Friday night in Alabama, we went to see a group called Pentatonics. They're an a cappella band. I'd seen them before about 8 years ago with a high school friend, and when he and I went to see them, I was pretty convinced in my mind that it would be worth the trip and the time and the money and so forth, and it was. I was convinced in my mind that it would be the same this time, and it was. They still had it. Keeping on that music analogy, you know that I love going to the Diana singing a couple times a year. A lot of people have convictions about the Diana singing. They're convinced that it's worth that trip and time to get there. No money is involved, obviously, unless you happen to pay for the concessions that they have there. But people come from all around to go to that. The first year that I went, there was a man there from Zimbabwe. So that pretty well tells you what people's attitude is towards it. But we have convictions in life. I talked to Truman about his mother one time. I never really knew her. She died before I was born, but she had a pretty firm conviction about what a person ought and ought not to do. He told me that she had basically a zero tolerance policy for foul language in her presence. She wasn't the type of person that would just let it happen. She would, as I understood it, the way he described her to me, she would tell you, you can clean up your language or get out of here. And that's a good conviction to have, obviously. It's kind of hard to put ourselves in that mentality and age when we become so desensitized to it. And I have a friend from college. His dad is kind of that same way with regard to TV shows. If he turns on a show on television and, there's a colorful word every 2 or 3 minutes or so, he'll change the channel. And I don't so much have to worry about that because I don't watch a whole lot of TV anyway, but I'd still try to be selective with what I do or don't watch. If a person is willing to travel hundreds and hundreds of miles to do something, you get the impression that that thing might be important to them. And think about Saul. Saul traveled probably 140 miles to go to Demascus from where he was at. And remember, there was no automobiles. 140 miles by car really isn't that long because you can travel that distance in about an hour and a half, 2.5 hours or so. Would have taken him a week to make this trip that he was going on. But he goes to this high priest and the Jewish council to ask for letters, probably something like arrest warrants for any Christians that he found. I read one commentator that said he was out for any and every Christian he could find, not just ones from Jerusalem, but if he saw them, he was going to find them. If he imprisoned them, that was good. If he could have them executed, that was even better. When you look at what he himself said later on in the book of Acts, in Acts 26 and verse 10, he said, I not only locked up many of the saints in prison after receiving authority from the chief priests, but when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. In other words, I voted for them to die. That's how badly he wanted to see this religion put out of business. And when you think about voting for someone to be put to death, there are crimes, even in our own country, where that happens. If someone votes for a person to be put to death, it has to be a pretty serious offense, right? But Saul goes off with this letter from the high priest and the convictions that he has. He goes off on this Damascus road. But a question I wonder about when I read him is, you have your convictions. What do you do if your convictions are ever shaken? What do you do if you're totally sure that you're right, you're in the right about something, but some time passes and you think maybe I might be mistaken about this? Well, maybe Saul had that happen to him on this road. But that leads us to this confrontation that happens between Saul and Jesus. Acts 22:6 says it was about noon when this happened. It was the last day of his trip going into Damascus. People usually stopped about midday to take some time to rest, but Saul apparently didn't. Saul kept on going straight into the city because that's how determined he was. Saul sees this vision of Jesus. He knew he was seeing some kind of vision from heaven, but he still didn't really know who this man was he was talking to. And the text here in chapter 9 says he heard Jesus, and later passages in Acts says that he saw Jesus. There was a man he was in the presence of, but the question was who? And you notice Saul asks that here. He says, "Who are you, Lord?" Not Lord meaning Christ the Lord, but something like sir or ma'am or madam. It was a term of address. Who are you, Lord? And the King James Version has what Jesus said to them. "I am Jesus whom thou persecutest. It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks." Some translations say goads, but that was a little stick an animal would, if they would kick back, they would kick back against that stick and it would prod them to move forward. They used it for stubborn animals. Well, Saul was kicking against the pricks here. Saul was working against someone that was for his betterment, because the devil had convinced Saul that Jesus is holding you back. Jesus is keeping you from doing all the things that need to be done. He's not allowing you to do what you want to do. Satan whispered that into Saul's ear, if you will, because Saul thought Jesus was a threat to Judaism. And Saul had to make a decision at this point when this happened. And he noticed when Jesus said to him, "I am Jesus," and he says, "Whom you are persecuting." Now we said before, remember, that Saul had never met Jesus so far as we know. He probably did hear him speak at different points in times, but we don't know that he had any in-person interaction with him. So why did Jesus say, "You're persecuting me"? Well, how did Saul treat Christians? Because how we treat God's people matters to the Lord. If Saul was doing it to one of them, then he was doing it to whom? He was doing it to Jesus. We think of passages like Matthew 25, when Jesus was talking about the final judgment day scene. And you remember in that passage, he said all the nations are gathered before them. He was going to separate them as a shepherd divides the sheep from the goats. The sheep are on the right there and the goats are on the left. You remember they're told similar but different things. One group is told by Jesus, "I was hungry and you gave me food." Another group is told, "You didn't." One group is told, "I was thirsty and you gave me drink." Another is told, "I was thirsty and you gave me no drink." One group is told, "I was sick and you visited me." Another group is told, "I was sick and you didn't visit me." How many things are we making any effort at all to do? Because I don't know if you caught it there in Matthew 25, but the most striking thing about that passage isn't that the people that were condemned eternally did things they were not supposed to do. It was that they neglected things that they should have done. And to me, that's one of the most glaring things about that passage. Because you don't read about any of those people being adulterers, murderers, or liars, or whatever, although that would apply, but you do read about them neglecting doing known good. And that's still sin. But Saul, because of how he treated Christians, treated Christ in the manner he persecuted him. And he's told what he had to do to make it right. If you notice verses 6 through 8 of that passage. Jesus told him, "Rise and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do." The men who were traveling with him stood speechless, hearing the voice, but seeing no one. Saul rose from the ground, and although his eyes were open, he saw nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. Can you imagine how humbling that must have been for him? Because you had this Pharisee going into this city. He has this type A personality. He's going in guns a-blazing, going to take the Christians in that place by storm. And then he has to be led by the hand by someone. It's as different as night and day. And verse 9 says that 3 days he was without sight and neither ate nor drank. So he was in a period of fasting. Evidently, he was sorrowful for what he had done. Saul had been confronted about being in rebellion to God just a few days before, and here we read about him fasting. We also read about him praying, incidentally. Saul was not yet saved, but you can see how his attitude towards Christ was changing. We're not going to dive into the text too much more deeply in Acts chapter 9, but he meets a Christian named Ananias. Ananias was a little scared of when he met Saul. When Jesus revealed to Ananias that he had to go and converse with Saul, Ananias said, "Lord, I've heard from people about this man. I know what harm he's done to your people." And Jesus gives him this reassurance. If you notice verses 13 and 15, Lord said to Ananias, "Go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel." Jesus reassured Ananias that Saul had changed, but he said, "Ananias, you need to show him what to do next." And Paul, when he talked about his conversion later, said that Ananias did that. He told him, "Why do you wait? Arise, be baptized, and wash away your sins, calling on his name." And that leads us to that challenge that Saul was presented with. Saul was told to take the gospel to the Gentiles. In Acts 26, which is a kind of a parallel passage where Saul was talking about his conversion, he said, Jesus said this to him in Acts 26, 16 through 18, "Rise and stand on your feet. I have appeared to you for this purpose." What is it? "To appoint you as a servant and witness to the things in which you have seen me, and to those things in which I will appear to you, delivering you from your people and from the Gentiles, to whom I am sending you to open their eyes, that they may turn from darkness to light, and from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me." If you were a Jew, how likely would it have been that you were told to go and speak to Gentiles, or how likely would it have been that you wanted to go and speak to Gentiles? They were not on your priorities. But sometimes we're implied to think that. Sometimes we're implied to think that that person isn't a good candidate for the gospel. Well, if we're going strictly by what was on paper, who should have been the best candidates for the gospel out of the Jews and the Gentiles? Should have been the Jews. The Jews had the Old Testament law of God. They knew the Messiah was coming. And the Messiah came and they rejected him and crucified him. The Gentiles in general were more receptive to him. So you had this group of pagans that really didn't know much about the one true God. And they were the ones who were clamoring for him by comparison when you look at how the Jews were. When you think about things that are uncommon, you think about what God expects of us versus what the world says we should do. The world says that we should look out for ourselves and take vengeance into our own hands if necessary. God says you should be a servant, be slow to anger, be always willing to forgive someone. Because, well, when God said, "Love your enemies and bless those who persecute you and do good to those who use you," that's probably not our base inclination to want to do that. Just by what we're wired as our first instinct to do. But that's what the Lord asks of us. The world says you should be out for yourself and for all you can get. But Christ says you should serve others. The world says religious pluralism is the best policy. You can have your religion, I can have mine. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. God says, the world says rather, that after everything you've done to me, I don't think I can ever forgive you. I don't want to see you again. Why don't you get out of my life? God says, wherever you've been and whatever you've done, if you'll come to me in penitence, I'm willing to forgive you. That road to Damascus changed everything for Paul. Maybe you're at a crossroads this morning. It's not quite New Year's yet, but maybe you've made this resolution in your mind that I'm going to start living for God. If you will come to Him in faith and repentance and confession and baptism, God's promised He's always willing to forgive us as long as it's called today. Maybe you've done that, but you've neglected some of your Christian duties in your life. Maybe serving God and serving man hasn't been a priority for you the way that it should have been. And we can offer prayers for you. We'll pray with you and for you. Whatever your need is, we ask that you come as we stand and as we sing.